For over 30 years, the team at Hope Store New Beginning Center, along with our clients and community partners, have been building lives without violence in Dallas and Collin counties. If you are in immediate physical danger, please call 911. If you need shelter or would like to talk to someone about receiving our other free services, please call our 24-hour hotline at 972-276-0057 in English or Spanish. At Hope Store New Beginning Center, we offer free trauma-informed services for those affected by domestic abuse, battering intervention and prevention services for those who have abused their partners in the past, and free community education services for any community group or organization. Domestic abuse is a human rights issue that affects a third of all Texans. We empower victims, perpetrators, and community members to live in safety and foster healthy relationships. Please call our 24-hour hotline for help or visit hdmbc.org to learn more about our services. And don't forget to follow us on social media. Hope Store New Beginning Center, building lives without violence.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. If you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live there, it's 106. My name's Ryan Thomas, and we're going to start the Dynamics of Domestic Abuse webinar here. I'm the Community Education Program Manager at Hope Store New Beginning Center, and my job is to go out into the community and talk to community members about the issue of domestic abuse, also informing people of the issue, but also letting people know about the free services that are available for victims of abuse in our community and their family members as well. So, the Community Education Department here, I made up our own little mission statement to promote healthy relationship skills and empower community members of all ages to understand abuse. So first we need to understand what it looks like, what the types of abuse are and the red flags, and we'll do that today, so that we can ideally prevent it from happening in our own relationships, either prevent myself from perpetrating abuse, either advertently or inadvertently, also be able to prevent myself from being victimized by abuse. And then that's the ideal situation. But if abuse already has happened, I want to empower people with some skills and information that they can use to respond to it effectively and support somebody who may be going through abuse, and also referring them to some free services where they can get some help. The agency at Hope Store New Beginning Center, our mission, official mission statement, is to provide intervention and prevention services to those affected by abuse in our communities, and also to increase the community's capacity to respond to it, like I was just saying, by picking up some of those tips and tools and skills that we can use to support victims of abuse in our community. It's also important that I say right off the bat that Hope Store New Beginning Center, we're accepting and affirming of everyone in our community, regardless of gender identity or age or relationship status. We also are accepting and affirming of all members of the LGBTQ community. So intervention and prevention, I think our common shared goal with everybody in our community is to have safe and healthy relationships. And one way that Hope Store New Beginning Center goes about empowering people to have those things is to offer our victim services to people who've been directly affected by abuse. And so we have our shelters, our 24-hour hotline answered in English and Spanish. We also have counseling for adults and kids. We have our legal support services and our transitional service, housing services for victims as well. But we also must hold the abusers or the offenders accountable as well. And so we have our Battering Intervention and Prevention Program, or BIP, to do that. And then lastly, our community education services, of which this is a part, that hopefully addresses all members in our community, including our youth, and to empower them with some information and knowledge to help them recognize abuse so that they can prevent it or respond to it effectively. For today, go ahead and ask any questions that you may have in the chat. I'm going to try to monitor that as we do. There will be an poll, in-webinar poll at the end of the webinar. It's 5 quick questions I'd like you to please answer, and it's anonymous. If anybody does need CEUs, if you can go ahead and just put your name and email into the chat box, I will send you a survey link for you to get your CEU certificate. All right, so there's always the plan, and then there's the reality, especially with technology and Zoom. I'll tell you the plan, on my best laid plan. I already talked to you guys a little bit about the mission of Hope Store New Beginning Center and some of our services. We're also going to get into the dynamics of domestic abuse and what abuse looks like, what are the red flags, what are the different types of abuse, what's at the center of abuse, why people abuse, why people stay in abusive relationships. We'll play a game called Cute or Creepy, and then talk about some tools and some knowledge, some tips that we can use to support victims in our community, or those that we know or work with. So I always like to kind of, start at the foundation of where a lot of the entitlement or excuses or rationalizations for abuse occur. And, a lot of research says that a lot of this gender-based violence is rooted in these rigid gender stereotypes that we have about particularly real men or real women in society and how they're supposed to act. If you ask any random person on the street, I think most of them will say something to the effect of, well, a real man is supposed to be dominant or assertive when it comes to, for example, like sexual relationships. They're the pursuer. Real women are supposed to be demure and submissive. Real men doesn't show any feelings or emotions. They can show anger is maybe one that's allowed. So these notions of what women and men are supposed to do in our society greatly affect our perception of how relationships should work, or what a healthy relationship does or does not look like. And so as individuals, we get a lot of input from these different facets of our community through socialization. Particularly for young people, peer groups can be particularly strong. But overall, I think that, if we were to ask young women, especially in America, to remember back when they were on the playground and maybe they were in first grade, and if there were a boy on the playground that were teasing you or maybe pulling your hair or throwing pebbles at you, what did that mean, right? And I've asked probably thousands of women this over the past few years, and they all can give the same answer, which is that if you're a little girl and a boy is teasing you or mistreating you, it means that he likes you. And so I always like to push back a little bit and say, well, who taught us that that's what that means? Why does everybody know that that's what that means? And most often the answer is that some adult, likely an adult woman, told young girls this. And if we think about that, that's a really weird message and wrong message to give to young girls, that if a boy is mistreating you, it means that he likes you, right? And so what this can become in an abusive situation in adolescence can be, well, jealousy is an expression of love, or they don't really love you unless they're jealous, or can it be used as an excuse for controlling behavior? For example, I had one high school girl in Garland say that her boyfriend is not controlling or possessive, but he's protective of her. And so we tried to establish, well, what is he really protecting you from? Are there lions or dangerous terrorists around? Well, that's probably code word for controlling and possessive, right? Young boys, we're often taught, if we are, in middle school or high school, and maybe we're not too coordinated, we're bad at sports, right? Somebody might say that we play like a girl, which of course is meant to be an insult. And if you think about it, it's a really weird message to give to young boys. We're automatically taught to devalue women, or that women are naturally weaker, and that it's actually an insult, and you should be offended to be compared to a woman or a girl or a female. And so we're working against this socialization and this inertia that a lot of us have. So the reason I point all of this out is because the more that we can do to alter our own views and the views, especially of young people that we have influence over, to get them to not hold on to these rigid gender stereotypes. And research says that the more somebody rigidly believes in these gender stereotypes, the more likely they are to be in abusive relationships, whereas the more likely somebody is to view the genders or genderless as equal, then the more likely they are to have healthy relationships. So ideally, we can have a large influence on the young people and even ourselves. I'm going to kind of move forward with what are we talking about here when we talk about abuse and what's real and what's not. I'd like to start out with this quote by the AMA about 4 myths that people believe, and it's been my experience, not just professionals, but most people in society, even the young, the youth, believe some of these to some degree. The first is that it's rare, doesn't happen that often. I'm about to make the argument with statistics and data that shows it's a lot more prevalent and a lot more common than we commonly understand, and the gravity is a lot more significant. There's another myth that it's a private matter. This is not my place to say anything. It's not my place to get involved. It's none of my business. I'm going to argue here in a moment that it is all of our business. It's a community matter. In fact, we're talking about a human rights issue. The third is that violence or abuse doesn't happen in normal relationships, whatever that means. If normal means the most common type, then that's precisely where most abuse is going to happen. In other words, abuse does not discriminate. And then lastly, there's this idea that still lingers that somehow the victim might be responsible for the abuse. At the very least, they could just leave, right? So why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? Which is sometimes said out of concern or love, but in the same breath blames the victim for the abuse that they're experiencing. So the idea that it's rare, we know is false. In America, 1 in 3 women will be a victim of abuse in one of their relationships. For men, it's 1 in 4 American men will experience abuse or violence from a partner. In Texas, we're actually a little worse than the national average, where 38% of Texas women, 27% of Texas men. So generally, if I'm in a room of 30 adults, 10 of those will be victims, right? And then for every victim, there's an abuser, so that means another 10 of that 30 are perpetuating abuse. So in any room, 2/3 of Texans are experiencing abuse in their relationships or will, either from a victim or an offender point of view. And that's a serious problem that we need to address, and that's not being talked about enough. It is important to recognize that men can be victims of female violence. Females can abuse females. Those who don't identify as a gender can perpetuate abuse against anybody else's gender identity. But it's also important to remember that women in particular suffer disproportionately from male violence. The male violence is much more likely to cause damage than the hospital, they have more significant injuries, and the lethality of male violence is a lot higher than female perpetuated violence. If you are watching Law and Order at night and a woman is murdered in the first minute of the TV show, who do the cops always go talk to first? Well, they go talk to either the boyfriend or the husband because that's statistically what's more likely to have happened. So if a woman's murdered in America, the chances are higher that her partner did it than anyone else in the world. And that's a big problem. And the same is true of injury. And then lastly there, we know if somebody experiences abuse once, they're much more likely to in the future. In other words, it's a cycle, it's a progression of violence. Unfortunately, teens don't fare any better than us, but this makes sense if we understand abuse is a learned behavior. So if about 1 in 3, 1 in 4 adults are going to be victimized, it kind of I'm not going to say makes sense, but statistically does not shock us to learn that about 1 in 3 teens also will experience abuse from a dating partner. We also know based on research that most abusers who abuse as adults began abusing in adolescence. And there's an intersection with bullying and child abuse and things like that as well. So this is a question I like to ask the teens when I go and talk to them in the high schools, that if I had 10 teenage girls right in front of you who were all being physically abused by their dating partner, what do you think the research says? How many of those 10 girls will not break up with that abusive dating partner? And usually the answers I get are pretty much right on. 8 out of 10 or 80% of teenage girls will stay with someone who physically abuses them. And this actually parallels what we know about adults as well. I've seen anywhere from 7 to 10 times an adult victim will leave an abusive relationship and go back to their abuser, leave 7 to 10 times before they finally leave for good. And so this is very counterintuitive and hard for us to imagine if we've never been in that situation. And so the question becomes, why do people stay in these abusive relationships? And I think it's important that we try to understand, for our own sake and also for the sake of others, so that we avoid inadvertently or advertently blaming them for the abuse. And so if we look at why people may stay in these violent or abusive relationships, the reasons are many, and they're complicated, and they're interconnected, and many times it's the safer option for them to stay. But needless to say, their fear of reprisals, they love their abuser. Many people forget that there are good times, or there have been good times. The victim may have been made to feel so stupid, ugly, worthless, and lazy that they don't think that anyone else would have them. They're scared to be alone. Money or having nowhere to stay is a huge issue. They want to be there for the kids, or maybe they've been cut off from their friends and family, or maybe they hope that they'll get that old partner back, that they'll change. Needless to say, it's really hard to just leave. I often like to ask people, have you ever hated a job? Or do you hate your job now? Or do you not like your boss? Inevitably, there are some who say yes. And so I say, well, why don't you just quit? Why don't you just quit right now, today? Why would you go back tomorrow? And so it's not so easy to just quit a job. Imagine how hard it would be to quit a whole marriage relationship. So it's not so easy. If we look at domestic abuse as a shared concern, as a community or as a global community, we'll quickly realize that what we're talking about here is a human rights issue, right? So, the United States, before the enslavement of human beings was outlawed, you had this sense of entitlement where a certain percentage of the population believed that they had a right to control other human beings. And that's precisely the dynamic that abusers have when they are abusing those closest to them. So if slavery is a human rights issue in all of our business, then so is domestic abuse. And it's also a public health crisis. Anywhere from $5 to $8 billion a year is spent on caring for the emotional and physical needs of victims of abuse. If we kind of look at a huge 3-column bullet list of the effects that are correlated with being a victim of domestic abuse, you can see here that they are wide and varied and many, and some are emotional. Some may be pose life risks like eating disorders, homelessness, joblessness, being 15 times more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol as a means of escape, being distrustful of others. It may manifest physically with GI problems or chronic pain or stress or hypertension, not to mention feeling anxious and depressed and worthless and alone, powerless. And so I like to talk about these for a second and imagine that these were the side effects that came at the bottom of the commercial for some new drug, right? And if these were the effects that were correlated with taking this drug, and 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 Americans were given this drug, that these were the likely effects to come about from taking that drug, the FDA would pull the drug, Congress would be up in arms, and we would never talk about this giving people this drug again. However, these are the effects that are correlated with someone being a victim of domestic abuse, and 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, 1 in 3 teens will be a victim of domestic abuse. This is a huge problem, and we need to all look at it and be aware, and we should all be up in arms about this, right? So again, thank you for joining me today and being part of this movement where we can actually address it. And if we look at the children who grew up in these abusive homes, like Lisa from the the video, we can quickly see that Lisa cannot advocate for herself. So this is not a private matter, right? This is all of our business, because these kids cannot escape these abusive homes. They can't advocate for themselves. So if we will not advocate for them, then who will? You can see a lot of the same emotions that children who witness abuse from are the same emotions that the victims themselves suffer from. And so we're talking about chronic trauma being delivered to the brains of these young people over and over and over again. Behaviorally, children who witness abuse in homes are more likely to stutter, have insomnia, have trouble making friends or keeping them. They're aggressive with other kids and adults. Sometimes they act out. They may have nightmares or bedwetting episodes. And then long term, kids who grow up witnessing abuse are more likely to drop out of school, take drugs and alcohol, engage in risky sexual behavior or become pregnant, commit violent crimes. And then, of course, like we talked about, because we know abuse is a learned behavior, they're much more likely to enter into abusive relationships themselves. And then if they have kids and the kids grow up witnessing this, the cycle of abuse is perpetuated. So this idea that abuse doesn't happen in normal relationships is, of course, false, because domestic abuse affects anyone regardless of income or age or education level or gender identity or sexual orientation, etc. Also, this idea of victim blaming can take these forms, right? Which, if I have a friend who, discloses to me that they're being abused, I might say something like, "Oh my God, Jenny, what did you say that made him so mad?" And what I mean to say is, tell me about what happened because I care. But if I use this word, "What did you say that made him so mad?" That word "you" there becomes very glaring, and it can make it sound like that she caused the abuse. And so if you just keep your mouth shut and don't say anything next time, it'll be okay. Or you're too smart to fall for that. Intelligence has no bearing on whether or not somebody is a victim of abuse or not. Or how could you let this happen? As if a victim lets abuse happen, right? So we really need to watch how we address and respond to a disclosure, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Suffice it to say that it is important to remember that nobody can make somebody be abusive, right? Abusive behavior is intentional. It's a choice that somebody is making. It is not related to an anger management problem. It's not that they can't control their temper or they just snap. And it's not about being drunk either. We know abusers who get ticketed by a police officer. They don't beat up the police officer when they're mad. They don't beat up their boss when their boss makes them mad. They don't beat up the woman at Starbucks who spilled his coffee. And so all of these are evidence that these abusers can control their anger, and they're quite good at it, and they do it all the time. They choose to abuse their partners or family members. Victim blaming can also take the form of just not understanding like what consent is or what types of abuse are. If we look at these posters made by college students who were victims of sexual abuse from their partners, if you look at the bottom here, the number of friends who told this victim that she should have drank less was 7 of them. So in other words, it was her fault for drinking too much. Or this question here that her friends asked her after she was sexually assaulted by her boyfriend: "How can it be rape if you guys were dating?" And so clearly we need to educate youth and all of ourselves that, yes, even if we're in a relationship or have been married for 60 years, you still need to get consent from any human that you wish to have sexual relations with. And really it is a matter of us just saying these things explicitly and saying them simply and out loud to children over and over and over. And we can't fall victim to the false belief that if we talk about these things with youth, it's going to make them want to do it, right? Research shows the more we talk to youth about suicide, the more likely they are to reach out for help if they need help with suicidal thoughts of their friends. And the same is true with abuse. We know that abuse occurs in a cycle, and this is, it's a graphic, and It looks like it should be in a textbook from 1983, and maybe it was, but there's a reason that this exists, and it's because almost every person that I've done the presentations with and told them about the cycle of abuse, a lot of them afterwards will come up to me and be like, "How did you know that's exactly what he did over and over and over?" It's like, wow, am I the only one? And, this exists because this is how most of these relationships work. And a lot of these abusers, they use the same tactics and it's the same thing over and over. Unfortunately, a lot of times these abusers are very charming at the very beginning of the relationship, or there's this grooming period or the honeymoon where many times victims of abuse after the fact will look back and say, well, he was so nice and sweet and amazing and caring and attentive in the beginning. And, all of a sudden, one day he wasn't and he was abusive. And many times they'll say, well, I want to get the old Bobby back, or how he used to be, not realizing that that person never existed, right? In an abusive relationship, after the honeymoon period, there's always going to be a time where tensions are built up, or the victim's walking around on eggshells. Nothing has happened directly yet, but they're maybe afraid to mention or say something or do something for fear of angering their partner. And so tensions are built up until some incident will occur, either verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, after which time there'll be a reconciliation phase where the abuser will either apologize, or they'll justify it, or they'll excuse it, or they'll blame the victim, or they'll promise not to do it again until calm is restored temporarily and the cycle repeats. Over time, this cycle gets faster and faster until really at the end of the cycle, it's just steps 1 and 2. It's fear and abuse, and fear and abuse. And if somebody is existing in this phase, many times the victim is traumatized and they are in fight or flight mode, and their frontal cortex has been taken offline, and they're not able to make these quick, rational decisions. And for someone to come along outside and say, well, why don't you just leave? It's quite literally that, impossible for them to use their faculties enough to get out of these relationships without help. And so that's where we come in, and we as community members, by referring these people to an agency like Hope Store New Beginning Center that specializes in treating victims of trauma who've been abused by their partners. So forms of abuse, I know most victims of abuse will say that it's the cuts and the bruises and the broken bones that will all heal, but it's the emotional trauma that can last a lifetime and most negatively impacts their quality of life. And of course, that's why we have our emergency shelters for that physical safety. But of course, that's also why we have our counseling and our groups to help our clients overcome that emotional trauma that they've suffered from and help them heal and live self-sufficiently in the future. So the power and control wheel on the left basically just illustrates how abuse works. Everything that we've talked about up until this point graphically. So at the center of abuse is the need for power and control. And if I'm an abuser, I have many ways of obtaining this power and control. And these are the pie pieces. So coercing them, threatening them, if somebody is undocumented, I may threaten to call immigration on them. I might intimidate them. It may be giving them a look or some sort of action. I know I was talking to a lawyer one time who had a client who was a victim of abuse, and she was on the stand testifying, and all of a sudden the client, the witness, she froze and stopped answering her attorney's questions. And so her attorney called for a recess to try to assess the situation, what's going on. She took her out into the hall, and the client said, nobody in the courtroom saw this, but when I was testifying, I was looking at my ex-husband, and he kept taking his ring on and off like this, looking at me menacingly. And that's what he used to do before he would hit me with that hand. Right. But no one else in the courtroom would have known that. And so he was, using those threats and intimidation silently in front of a judge. And so it's always really hard for sometimes people to believe victims of abuse, or sometimes they'll try to, explain it away or minimize the gravity of it. Cutting them off from friends and family, using male privilege, like we've talked about, controlling the money, or making somebody account for every dollar they've spent, or bring receipts, or give somebody an allowance, using the children against them. If you leave me, I'm going to take the kids and you'll never see them again. I know one of a Frisco firefighter, after one of my presentations, came up to me and said, he really liked the presentation because he could identify with it. And so I asked him, do you mind if I ask what you could identify with? And he said, well, I stayed in an abusive marriage for 7 years. And I said, do you mind if I ask why you stayed? And he was a big 6'4" firefighter. And he said that he stayed in that abusive relationship for his children, that he didn't want his children to grow up without a father because that had happened to him. And he was committed to being there for them as a father. And so for concern of his children, he stayed in that abusive marriage. Sorry, on the power and control wheel, lastly, at the end of the spectrum, once the progresses, it can lead to this physical and sexual violence, where really this is one of the few aspects of abuse that society deems as illegal. And so this is also a problem, because if I'm intimidating my girlfriend, and I'm emotionally abusing her, and I'm trying to cut her off from friends and family, and I'm minimizing the abuse or blaming her for it, none of those things are illegal. And so many times people don't understand that this is not normal and it is abuse. And so the more we can educate people on what a relationship should look like, particularly the young people, which is what we at Hope Store New Beginning Center do when we go and visit middle schools and high schools in the area, is try to teach kids what a healthy relationship should look like. Because we can't always just say, tell them what not to do and wag our finger at them. We have to tell them explicitly what healthy relationships look like and model those for them. So I'm kind of different. I like to put my definition in the middle of my PowerPoint. So what have we been talking about so far? What is domestic abuse? Basically, it comes down to these few characteristics: that it's a series of behaviors, it's a pattern, it's a cycle, right? The whole point's to maintain or gain and then maintain power and control. So how do they do it? These abusive and coercive and harmful behaviors, which is a choice. It's not about losing one's temper or being drunk. And it's a learned behavior, which is good news because we can teach healthy relationship behaviors. And it's also correlated with those rigid gender stereotypes and that sense of entitlement. And I think that Power and Control Wheel does a really good job of kind of illustrating all of that graphically. I see I'm about 150 here, so I'm not going to do the game Cute or Creepy with you the whole game, but I will briefly go over the answers that young people give when playing the game. So I usually tell the audience in an interactive session, imagine that you are dating somebody, and I'm going to give you a situation. And so if your boyfriend or your girlfriend did this, would you think it was cute? In other words, it was endearing, you want them to keep doing it, made you feel good, or creepy? Now, I didn't like when they did that, or if they were to do that, it would make me feel uncomfortable and I would want them to stop. So we can play along pretty quick here. I want you to imagine that your boyfriend or girlfriend wants to sit next to you at lunch. Is that cute or is that creepy? Cute. Well, what if they want to sit next to you at lunch every day? Now, does it change? And about half the people usually change and say, oh, no, that's too much. I need my space. That's creepy. Some people still think it's cute. Right? If we probe a little deeper and say, asking high school kids, what if your boyfriend or girlfriend told you that they love you? Is that cute or creepy? And they would say, maybe it depends on how early in the relationship. So what if it's the first week of going out? Oh, no, that's creepy. Nope. Clearly they're lying. My mama loves me more. There's, that's too early. And so even teens have a sense that, okay, if it's sitting next to you every day, that has this kind of a negative connotation to it. And then if they tell me they love me too soon, then it kind of has a negative connotation to it. Well, what if your boyfriend or girlfriend tells you you need a haircut? And then what if they give you money and suggest how it would be, how much better your hair would look a certain way? Um, Many people say, no, this is too much. Even the fact that they give me money makes it worse, which is interesting. But people pick up on when we add these qualifiers, why it suddenly changes to being creepy. If somebody were to tell you they loved you so much that no one else on earth could ever love you more than I do, a lot of people say that's creepy, right? When on the surface, it looks like something we would all want, right? I want someone to love me a lot. Your boyfriend or girlfriend wants to hold hands with you. Oh, that's cute. But all night at a party? Oh no, that's somehow creepy. And so if we kind of look at these behaviors, why do a lot of our answers change from cute to creepy? Right? Is it abusive to want to sit next to my girlfriend every day? Is it abusive to give my girlfriend money and tell her to get a haircut? Is it abusive to want to hold my girlfriend's hands all night at a party? Well, not really. But there is something weird about these behaviors, and it may be hard for us to identify. Uh, we may just get this sense in our gut that something's not right or something's weird. But if we really look at these behaviors and try to identify what do they all have in common, we can see that all of these are controlling behaviors. And it's particularly those qualifiers that make it feel controlling to the degree that it can make somebody feel uncomfortable. And so it's really important for everybody to realize that if I'm in a relationship and my partner does something and it makes me not like it, or it was creepy, or it was too much, and then this happens again and over, those are red flags that are indicating that your partner is being controlling, which we know is at the center of abuse. So to be able to identify those red flags is super important, and also to remember that abuse is about power and control, not love, right? And that all abusive behaviors can be interpreted as a tactic to gain or maintain that power and control. If we can begin to identify patterns like that, then we can begin to empower ourselves to either get out of those relationships, or help somebody else get out of one of those relationships, or sometimes even check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. I've had a lot of participants come up to me after presentations, and a lot of them women, saying things like, well, I have a friend who's abusive to her husband. And I'm like, it's you, right? And yes. And so it can be very eye-opening too for us to see this through a lens in our own relationships, and realize that, ooh, maybe some of these things I do are not that healthy, and I didn't realize that I'm doing them. So the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is the breakup, because if what an abuser wants most is power and control over another individual, if that individual breaks up and leaves the relationship, the abuser has lost the thing that they want most, that power and control. Though many times they'll do anything to get it back, which is why it's really important to stress the importance of safety planning for victims. And it's also important to recognize that this should be done with a professional. Ideally, there are a lot of online resources, but it's super important to do safety planning before somebody leaves the abusive relationship, so that things can be thought out ahead of time, and so that in a dangerous instance, or in a moment where maybe I can't think rationally because I'm in a state of trauma or a fight or flight or fear, if I have a piece of paper, or I've discussed it ahead of time about what I should do or what I should tell my kids, or I have money or a safe bag at somebody's house, it makes somebody much more able and empowered to leave the relationship when the opportunity arises for them to do so. So this is the end of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do if somebody reaches out to us. So again, we need to remember to avoid that victim blaming. So we don't want to say things like this, which might dismiss or minimize abuse. Not everybody argues, or boys will be boys, or but he goes to my church. He seems like a nice guy to me. This can disempower victims and perpetuate abuse. We don't want to use the word you when listening to a victim, right? Didn't he tell you not to wear that? Hadn't you been drinking? What did you say that made him so mad? We also don't want to be dismissive with things like just diffuse the situation, or just avoid him, or just go with the flow. This can be very dangerous. So for the warning signs, they are the common ones. I think the most, the biggest warning sign for us to see, and I tell people that if you suspect someone you know or love is being abused, you're probably right. There are reasons we feel those intuitions, but particularly if somebody has stopped, you notice that they stopped grooming themselves, or maybe they started abusing drugs and alcohol, or anytime you mention it, they're very defensive. We know oftentimes they will make excuses for their partner or defend their partner, the one who's abusing them. They can begin to stop hanging out with friends, or stop joining for happy hour. They may say things like, if they've been invited somewhere, I have to check with so-and-so, my partner. They're always deferring to their partner, or what their partner wants. That's a huge warning sign that somebody might be being abused by them, in addition to bruises, or things that are being tried to cover up with eyeglasses or makeup or clothing that doesn't fit with the season, etc. So if we do recognize these things, it's always important. I need to remind myself, but also everybody I come into contact with, that this is not hopeless work that we're doing. Even us as a community member just joining this webinar, that it's hopeful work, and that we actually need to be heartened, because we can actually change a life. And it's actually very easy to push somebody in a direction that is going to either disempower them, right? So we don't want to tell people what to do. Even as a friend, we don't want to come in here and I'm going to fix this for you. And because precisely the thing they've been missing in their abusive relationship is the sense of control over their own life. So if we, as a family member, friend, HR person, we come in and try to tell them what to do, we're disempowering them, and we're taking that power of choice and that control away from them. So what is the goal then for us? I always tell people, the goal is to empower them. And how do we do that? So we give them things. We give them information. We give them resources. We give them emotional support and verbal support. We say things like, hey, I watched this webinar with a weird bald guy, and he works for a place that they have free shelter, free legal services, counseling, and transitional housing. Why don't you check them out? And really, that's all we can do. And that's our goal. So always listen, right? When somebody is disclosing, or you think they may be in an abusive relationship. And then if they do disclose to you, that you believe them when they say that, and you validate their feelings, and remind them that it's not okay, and it's a crime, and you don't deserve to be treated that way, and abuse is not love. And sometimes we may think that people know this, and so we don't need to say it, but all the research says, say it anyway, right? You're not alone. You're not to blame for this, and you're not going crazy, and there is help available. So again, for us, remember not to give advice, but we want to empower them with information and options and choices, and ideally refer them to the professionals. So if somebody reaches out to you, try to remain supportive and non-judgmental. We don't use words like you. We don't ask them why questions. We just want to hear about their experience. And then when they do tell us, we believe them. We let them know that we love them, we care about them, we're concerned. And then to maintain contact, because isolation, both physical and emotional, can be very, very powerful. And so, if I reach out to a friend and I'm like, hey, I'm here for you, and then they keep going back to their abusive partner, if I'm just like so frustrated and don't understand that I stop contact with that person, I may miss an opportunity next week when they are ready to leave or when they do feel safe enough to leave. So always keep that communication open, telling them, of course, they're not alone. There is help out there, and it's not okay. Physical danger is always call 911 first of all, but that free help is available, and all somebody has to do is call our 24-hour hotline, answered in English and Spanish at both of our shelters, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even if somebody doesn't need shelter, maybe they just want to do an intake to speak to one of our lawyers, call that 24-hour hotline number, right? So it's important that we not judge how good our intervention was by what the victim chooses to do right then. I may plan this big intervention and talk to my best friend that I'm concerned and do all the right things, and then they may say, mind your own business. Well, I don't know if they may have just been defensive or scared right then. Maybe they'll call later that night. Maybe they'll call next week. Maybe they'll never call. Maybe it'll be a year from now. But we cannot judge how successful our intervention was by what they choose to do at that moment. We have to just remember that when they are ready, if we've empowered them with the information, the resources, and maintain contact with them, that when they're ready, they will reach out for help and we will be able to help them. So if you've acknowledged their situation, you've validated their feelings, and you've given them resources and information, you've done what we can to help, even as frustrating as that may be sometimes. I love this quote by Bruce Perry that there's no more effective neurobiological intervention than a safe relationship. What? You mean I can change somebody's brain? I can change their neurocircuitry by just caring about them and believing them and listening to them and validating their feelings? Yes. And I like to show people this Facebook message I got from a former middle school student of mine. I was her teacher in 2004, and then 15 years later, I get this message on Facebook. She said, thanks, you're one of the best teachers I had. I tell my kids all the time, science, blah, blah, blah. But if you look down there at the bottom, it said, you made your school fun, and you made your classroom a safe place to talk to you about anything in life. I appreciate that a lot because sometimes that is all I needed, right? All she needed was to feel safe sometimes, right? And I had no idea because I spent hours and hours planning all these lesson plans and science experiments and STAR tests. But the only thing she remembers 15 years later is that I made her feel safe. Wow. So we can have a big influence, right? Just by making somebody feel safe. So your feedback is valuable to me. So two things. I'm going to start a poll right now, which is a survey that I need to collect for our grantors if they ask. And it's just 5 short little questions you could literally probably answer in 15 seconds. So I'm going to launch that now. If you are on Zoom, if you could answer that, that would be great. It also helped me improve my my programming. If you do need CEUs, please put in your email and name in the chat box, and then I will send you a link. It should also open up a new browser window when you close the Zoom. If not, just shoot me an email and I will be happy to send you the link to that CEU survey. So just a reminder that anyone can go online to check out our community education services. You can read all about our different presentations we have available to teens and to professionals and adults. You can request an educator. We can do a personalized, customized, in-person or Zoom training for your group or organization. Just a reminder about our free services for victims in our community, our hotline, emergency shelters, counseling, legal support, transitional housing, case management. These are some pictures of our Garland shelter, just to remind everyone that really the goal is to make people feel safe and not re-traumatize them. And so it can be pretty cool to look at some of these pictures and think that these are where families go when they are experiencing trauma, and what a beautiful, safe place that would feel like to grow up in, as opposed to an abusive household. Our BIT program is available for offenders, and then our community education team is here for your training needs. Last thing, I'll put up my contact information. So if anybody has a question, please reach out to me. Email, you can call, you can text. You could really just call any number and ask for the bald tattooed guy, and they'll know who you're talking about. If I can do anything for you, your organization, or answer any questions, please reach out at any time. I hope you found this valuable. If so, if you could spread the word of mouth, and let people know in your social and business networks about our webinars, that'd be greatly appreciated. Also, please reach out so that we can do one specific to your group or organization. We'd be happy to put that together for you. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for supporting survivors of abuse in our community. Education is the key to prevention. If you found this webinar valuable, please share it with your social and business networks. For information on upcoming webinars, please visit hdnbc.org/webinars. Or from our homepage, click Webinars under the Get Educated tab. And check out the HDNBC Community Education page at hdnbc.org/get-educated for more information on school presentations, live trainings, Zoom webinars, and our other educational programs for community organizations, businesses, first responders, youth groups, and more. There you can submit a request for one of our educators to speak to your group. As a trauma-informed agency, we are accepting and affirming of all members of our community. We serve women, men, non-binary individuals, adolescents, teens, and all members of the LGBTQ+ community. If a survivor reaches out to you, try to remain supportive and non-judgmental. Let them know you believe them and want to hear their story. Let them know you care about them and are concerned for their safety. Maintain contact with them. Emphasize that abuse is never okay, they are not alone, and it is not their fault. Tell them to call 911 if they are in physical danger. Tell them that free help is available. Hope Store New Beginning Center's 24-hour hotline at 972-276-0057. Our trauma-informed services are for anyone who has been affected by domestic abuse, including our 24-hour hotline, 972-276-0057, 24-hour emergency shelters, individual and group counseling for adults and children, legal support, case management, transitional housing, community education, and our battering intervention and prevention program. We also have volunteer opportunities available. And don't forget about Hope Store Resale Store in Plano. All proceeds from the resale store help to fund our free services. For more information or to ask a question, please call our main office line at 972-422-2911. Check out our website at hdnbc.org or send an email to info@hdnbc.org. Hope Store New Beginning Center, building lives without violence.